Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Chapter 1. Before breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were sitting at the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arble. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was the only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it, just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arble put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father's right. Your pig will probably die anyways." Fern pushed the chair out from the way and ran out the doors. The grass was wet, and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were soppy by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arble stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death. About controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks as she took a hold of the axe and tried to pull it out from her father's hand. "Fern," said Mrs. Arble, I know more about raising litter of pigs than you do. The weaklings make trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help but being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arble smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, and a little runny pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I've ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arble's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house, and I will bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start on a bottle like a baby, and then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arble returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee and bacon. Damp plaster, wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arble. Mr. Arble set the carton down on Fern's place, and then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them with the roller towel. Fern slowly came down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there were scratching noises. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton. There inside, looking up at her, was a newborn pig. It was a white one. The morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arble, "saved from an untimely death. And may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "oh, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father and then kissed her mother. And then she opened the lid again and lifted the pig out and held it against her cheek. At this moment, her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed, an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's that?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" "She's got a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arble. "Wash your hands and your face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery, setting his gun down. "You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine species of a pig. That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat. Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be along in about a half an hour." "Can I have a pig too, Pop?" asked Avery. "No, I only distribute pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arble. Fern was up at daylight trying to rid a word of justice. As the result, she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nevertheless a pig. It just shows what can happen if a person gets out of bed promptly. Let's eat. But Fern couldn't eat until the pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arble found a baby nursery bottle, a rubber nipple. She poured the warm milk into the bottle, fitted the nipple over the top, and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arble, taking the pig from Fern and slipping the donut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another donut. The children ran out to the road and climbed into the bus. Fern took no notice to the others on the bus. She sat and she stared out the window, thinking of what blissful world it was to have, and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting one of the most beautiful names she could think of. "Its name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself. She was thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Fern, what is the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern. Dreamily, the pupils giggled. Fern blushed. Chapter 2. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, feed him, and put him to bed. Every morning as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed.